Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. Outlander is a historical fantasy TV show from Starz Entertainment, where Highlander Jamie Fraser and his time traveller wife Claire are in the midst of Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite uprising. Episode 10, Prestonpans, picks up a month or so after the end of last week's episode, where Claire's found lamenting on finding a literal stiff of a Highlander. She has a wee monologue about how her pals might die, and then gets practical and takes his pike staff, but not his dirk for some reason. Silly Claire. Back at the Jacobite camp, Charlie is arguing with the various generals and advisors as Irish and Scots grit is vying with practicality. Because, see, there's an issue with the terrain. The problem is the Jacobite army is encamped to Prestonpans, with the British army facing them down from near Kilkenzie on the other side of the marshy Trinent Meadow. Some want to risk it, but others are more wary of rushing through what could be a death trap. As usual, Big Jamie's the voice of reason, but tempers are all over the place, and without some action, it's likely that the sides are going to fall apart, and that the wee revolution might just end here and there. And as usual, Charles is grateful for Jim's wisdom, but then also tells him that when the battle comes, Claire's to treat the injured British troops first, which Jamie knows isn't going to go down well with the Highlanders, but he knows that he has to go along with what the prince says in the hopes of peace in the future. Tensions are also running high amongst Jamie's super team, with Angus tormenting a couple of wee cotters, but Jamie does a little bit clever delegation and convinces Dougal to ride out into the boggy meadow to test the ground, knowing that he should be safe from the British rifles at that distance. So Dougal rides out and tries to reenact the opening scene from Dances with Wolves, but his horse ends up getting stuck and his wee blue bonnet gets shot off. But he's safe and a hero, and the Bonnie Prince hugs him and tells him that he's great, and then everything's rosy. But they clearly can't make a march over that ground, so they need to find another way to defeat the British troops. Claire, on the other hand, is busy running a sort of old-fashioned sickbay and telling the ladies there to stock up on honey water and bandages while Fergus gets bored in the background. Then, a young man called Anderson shows up, and he tells Claire that he knows a way through the bog, and after a chat with all the High Hegians, they buy into his idea. So everyone's stealing for the battle that's now definitely going ahead, and the wee cotter blokes we saw earlier start promising each other that if either one of them dies, the other's going to look after his home and family. Spurred on by this, Angus then tries to get Rupert to agree to the same, and he's all like, "Get stuffed, you dafty." Meanwhile, Jamie and Murtagh have a wee bleak chat about the failure to stop all of this happening in Paris, and the resolve to now win this through for Scotland. And then everyone goes round to Claire's bit and says goodbye, with Angus asking for a wee kiss, then Rupert refusing to say goodbye. It's a tender moment because Claire doesn't really know if her knowledge of the future has changed or if it's going to be the same. She doesn't know who will live or die. Anything could happen. So during the night, they all troop through the woods and sneak up behind the British camp, just as the Sea Hares come in the morning and the mist's covering them. And oh look, wee Fergus has snuck off with them. Meanwhile, back at camp, Claire gives a rousing speech to the nurses, and after that, it's all on. Death, battle and blood. And it's not long before Ross, one of the cotters, comes back with his pal. He's gotten himself dead on the battlefield. And then it turns into a stream of folk coming back to the sickbay. First, Angus comes in with a badly hurt Rupert, who got slashed really badly, and then Angus himself is concussed after a scary-looking cannon blast. So Claire sews Rupert up, and Angus watches over him. And then Jamie comes in with Murtagh, and they're okay, and there's almost no Scottish casualties at all, and even wee Fergus is alright, even though he's a bit shell-shocked after having to stab an English soldier. Now, while Claire's been following the Italian dwarf's orders, Dougal's, on the other hand, has been getting stab-happy on the field with the injured British troops, and it comes across that English officer from way back in Season 1. He's hurt, but like in Egypt, he goes and tells Dougal that there's no way the Scots can beat the English, so Dougal ends up stabbing him, and then goes off to make more folk get dead. And back in the sickbay, people are dealing with the grief and their worry, and there's a little bit of light relief where Jamie has to go and pee in a jar and makes a bet of it with the British troops. And just as he's doing so, the Bonnie Prince wanders in and starts making a big, great wee speech about brotherhood amongst English and Scots, and it's all going really well until Dougal bursts in with his blood all up, all shouty, and then he's about to slaughter all the Englishmen in front of him until the Prince stops him and then tells him what a bad he is and banishes him from the army. But Jamie has a better idea and suggests they make him a dragoon and send him off on ranging parties doing guerrilla attacks so the Prince never has to see him again. And things seem to be winding up when Angus suddenly keels over, and it turns out that the cannon blasts caused some kind of ballooning inside him, and there's nothing they can really do because he's been walking wounded, bleeding internally, and then he ends up choking on his own blood, desperately pleading with his eyes and trying to say something to Claire that gets lost as he finally slips away. And in the final sweet moment, the injured Rupert drags himself over to his friend and takes a sword that Angus promised him earlier. Meanwhile, outside, the soldiers celebrate still being alive, and the mourners lament, and Claire points out that she might have been right about Prestonpans. Could mean that she's also right about Culloden ending in disaster, and the episode finally closes as Ross and Rupert sing an old war song amongst the dead men and muse on the emptiness of it all. So what did I think? Well, this was quite a tough one, It's a solid episode. The cast really brought it together for this one, and clearly showrunner Ron Moore is really happy when it comes to doing war stories, which isn't surprising considering him and a lot of the other folk who work on Outlander were the same people who made Battlestar Galactica and Deep Space Nine. And a lot of this episode was just straight up great in the way it was all built together. I mean, the way that they build up the action and the rise and the fall of Dougal, Jamie taking command in loads of situations, and of course, the death of Angus and all the horror of the aftermath of the battle. I'll admit, I shed a few tears during this episode. But I'd really like to commend the stunt and action team on this one, because there's some fantastic war footage, gory, shocking and powerful, but never feeling fun or exaggerated. I mean, we're really glad that our heroes survived, but it was shot doesn't make you want them to be in that situation or to be there yourself. There's nothing fun about this. I'd also like to say that Stephen Walters, who played Angus since the very first episode with a wee filthy glee, has been absolutely brilliant on the show. He's been a proper stalwart, and his loss is going to be felt, even though he hasn't been in that much of this season. But he provided a lot of the comic relief, as well as some of the real heart of the show. He's a good actor, and he's not been in nearly enough stuff. And I also really liked the work between Graham McTavish and Andrew Gower as Dougal and the Prince. And that was a wonderful little bookending in the episode between the opening scene with them and the end scene with them. The sort of the love and the hate and, the understanding of the Prince really getting to know what kind of man Dougal is. I mean, it's really hard to say much about this other than it was really good. I mean, the bleak tone and very human pondering on death and danger all the way up to the battle, and then in the aftermath and that final moment of Grant O'Rourke playing Rupert, singing the song, and then gazing off into the distance as the episode ends. I mean, that was just hauntingly brilliant. He's really good as well, and it'll be interesting to see how his character develops after the death of the character of Angus, because the pair of them always made such a good double team. But this is Grumpy Opinions, and there were a few things that bugged me about this episode. I mean, first off, there's an old comedy skit on British TV that was about watching old war movies, and it was called Spot the Stiff. And it was plainly, you knew somebody was going to die in the film because they would give away something. Usually it was a soldier in a World War II film who would say, as soon as we get home from battle, I'll marry my childhood sweetheart. And it was like, oh, he's going to be the one who dies. Now, to some extent, this episode really felt like playing a game of that. As every other scene, there was a kind of a big wink nod foreshadow about somebody who's probably going to die. And it seemed like every 5 minutes they were pointing at a new character that was going to be. I mean, it started off with thinking it might be Dougal, and then it thought it was Angus. Then it was going to be Fergus. Then it was going to be Rupert. And then it turned out to be Angus in the end. And in a way, I felt that distracted me a little from the full power of it when it came. I mean, it's all to do with the writing and structure of things like that. But it didn't help that I was also shocked to see that Claire, a trained battlefield nurse who's supposed to be trained in triage, wouldn't have checked Angus more thoroughly after hearing that a cannon blast had gone off near him. Now, I mean, I'll admit, I'm not really a first aid expert, but I know that enough that explosions can cause concussions and pressure injuries and the balloon effect and organ ruptures and stuff. And Claire survived the Blitz and the war in France, so you'd expect her to be familiar with these sorts of injuries. In fact, in a lot of ways I felt oddly like that the brilliant team acting in this and all the work all round had the strange effect of actually making Jamie and Claire seem a little bit superfluous this week. I mean, Jamie less so than Claire, and maybe it's just because the show is so normally all about them, but this week I found Claire's part of the story somewhat largely removable. I mean, essentially she didn't really do or say all that much. And Jamie's part, while interesting, wasn't quite as central to the plot as you'd normally expect. I mean, yeah, sure, he showed a little bit of initiative here and there and did some clever things. But on the whole, it kind of really felt like one for the rest of the cast. And that's more criticism. The show's over-focus on them, perhaps, from time to time. But this felt more like a rounded universe of characters rather than the Jim and Claire show. But all in all, I've got to say, this has probably been one of my favourite episodes of the show so far, and certainly of this season. So till next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.